Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on the power of intersectionality in the endowment and the urgency of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and racial equity in the investment process. Thank you for joining us. My name is George Dyer. I'm the Executive Director of the Intentional Endowments Network, or IEN. And we're so pleased that you took the time to join this conversation, which is actually a conversation or a continuation of a conversation that we started back in April at our annual summit with this amazing panel of investment experts, practitioners, thought leaders, who I will introduce in just a minute. But first, for those of you who aren't familiar with IEN, we're a nonprofit peer learning network that supports endowments and their service providers in advancing mission-aligned investing, that investing that considers environmental, social, and governance factors in the investment process. IEN has about 210 members in the network. And if you're a guest joining us today, we encourage you to have your organization join and really dive in with other members of the network and support this important work. So within the network, we've got a big focus on justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, or JEDI. And a couple of years ago, our JEDI working group published a primer on racial equity investing for endowments with a series of recommended actions. And a lot of our work since then is focused on helping our members take those actions. And this webinar is a part of that. It's actually the second in a three-part series that started last month around the Juneteenth season. Last month's webinar focused on addressing implicit bias in the investment process. And we'll hold our next one in August with more details and the date to follow shortly. And we welcome ideas on topics, speakers on these areas from the network. So please be in touch if you've got ideas that you'd like to share. And we can go to the next slide. I also just wanted to mention that we're thrilled to have recently welcomed Dorian Nunez to the team as a senior fellow with IEN. Dorian has had a long career on Wall Street and has been working for years on issues related to diverse managers and other JEDI-related themes. Dorian also serves as the co-chair of IEN's JEDI working group, which we encourage you all to get involved with if you're not already. We've also been ramping up our work to engage HBCUs in this work. We've hired an HBCU consultant to help with that and to grow our partnerships with HBCUs. We've joined the HBCU Business Deans Roundtable, and we'll be sharing more with the network on those efforts in the months to come. But overall, we're really excited to be continuing to expand our work and engagement on these topics, working with Dorian, with our new director of JEDI, Paris Prince, who's been doing a fantastic job accelerating this work, and with all of you. So please stay in touch. Again, if you're not already a member, please do join IEN to help us move this work forward together. We can go to the next slide, just a few housekeeping points about the webinar. Please use the chat for comments, or if you're having any tech issues, use the Q&A for questions for the panelists. We'll dedicate quite a bit of time to Q&A, so please start putting those questions in throughout the presentations. And this webinar will be recorded and available to you afterwards. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel for today. We'll hear from Dorian Burton, who's the managing partner of the Southern Reconstruction Fund, which is a social impact fund committed to strengthening the American South by transforming communities most affected by racial injustice and systemic inequity into beacons of health and prosperity. We'll also hear from Kunle Apampa, who is Director and Head of Client Advisory and Partnerships at Capricorn, and Habib Moudachirou, who is co-founder and Chief Investment Officer of V-Square Quantitative Management, and who oversees research and portfolio management there. And finally, Tamara Larsen, who is a partner and the ESG investments practice leader at Mercer, as well as on the finance committee at the David Rockefeller Fund, and co-chair of our steering committee at the Intentional Endowments Network. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Tamara, to kick us off.
Thank you so much, George, and welcome everyone. We're so excited to continue this discussion. Just taking a step back, so much has changed since our April discussion. It seemed like we had so much momentum over the last 2 to 3 years, particularly around racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we approach it as a society, and then also how we as the finance industry approach it, including within institutional portfolios. But at least for me, it feels like we've had wave after wave after wave of ESG backlash in recent months, actually over the past year. But it seems like it's accelerating. So we'd like to begin, before getting into our panelist discussion, we'd like to take a quick pulse from our audience about where you stand in implementing DEI and JEDI approaches in your portfolio. So poll question one, is this a moment or a movement? So where do you stand? We have a few options here. Do you have no plans to discuss it in your board and IC meetings? Are you at that education phase? Have you gone past the education phase and now you're setting goals and metrics? Are you at the phase of tracking metrics and progress towards your goals, or are you pretty much stalled and not making progress? I'll give that a few minutes so we can start tabulating the results. All right, while we wait for those results to come in, maybe we'll start with the panelists. What are you hearing and seeing amongst your clients? Okay, here we are. All right, so it looks like a good proportion, 64% are setting goals and metrics with a good almost 40% tracking progress towards goals. And not much, about as many stalled versus no plan. So to our panelists, is this surprising? What are your thoughts and what are you observing? Dorian, do you want to lead off?
Sure, I'm happy to. One, thank you guys for having me. I think one of the things that I think we're seeing on the field, and I think from our grantees to potential investments or investees that we're looking at across deals, is that I think particularly on the corporate side, you think about in the wake of George Floyd, you saw this kind of huge explosion of DEI efforts and Black Lives Matter statements. And I think you're coming into a space where you now are starting to, those moments are starting to fade. And I think you're seeing, this kind of constant loop that we've been stuck on domestically, in kind of this temporary moments of solidarity, right? Where folks will come together for a time and then go back to their lives. And I think, particularly for undercapitalized communities, mainly communities of color, we see these temporary moments of solidarity quite often, right? You see investments made along grant cycles, or you see investments made along or within those temporary moments, but you don't see those being sustained. And I think when you look at the 200+ billion that was committed in the wake of George Floyd by corporate actors, you're starting to see, what does that commitment actually mean? What have those commitments actually produced in terms of impact? What did those companies stand to gain from those commitments? Because I think we have to be really truthful about that, right? A lot of those commitments were actually made on debt, on the side of debt. So it was the companies that made those commitments stood to gain a lot from them. And I think, we have to ask ourselves, what and how do we kind of take those to task and move away from these temporary moments of solidarity when we're talking about how we put capital on the ground to make sure we're actually investing towards equity. And I think, again, we've seen that across the field, and this is a cycle that we've been on kind of on repeat. But I think that we definitely have to move away from, but that's what I'm seeing on the ground. And I think there's a big fear from that, because you do start to see that pullback. And folks are worried about where capital is going to come from, and if people are going to make good on those promises. I'd say the last piece, and I'll stop, is that I think a lot of folks felt like some of their DEI strategies were more of the PR strategies. And was it an actual investment towards equity and inclusion, or was it this temporary moment that we're going to use as kind of our PR strategy with a relatively low lift and a low investment? And so I think that there's those questions that are floating in and around that.
Habib, what's your view?
I'm getting off the mute. Thank you for having us. It's a great opportunity to have the time to unpack a lot about those questions. Yes, the poll is very telling, and I'm totally with Dorian on the fact that there's a lot of commitments we've seen, and many of them are still aspirational. Even though we think that the momentum is being lost, they're still very aspirational. And on the day-to-day, what I talk, this is something that I always talk about, thinking about policies versus practices. So we have a lot of companies out there, especially in the financial industry, but it's everywhere. But here we're talking more about the investment sector. So you see all those commitments, and when you go to them with ideas or with solutions or with totally, I would say, solid investment cases, business investments, opportunity or funds or anything, generally, you realize that despite the commitment, the same structural barriers are still up. And you still have those barriers of size. So, you know, as I don't like to use that term emerging manager because I like to say that I like to think that I emerged 20 years ago when I started managing money. But, you know, when you start an initiative, a fund or an investment company, then you need investors, and then you go see those investors, and they all tell you, those companies, large companies, that this is great what you're doing. This is really powerful. This is a great investment strategy, but you are too small to get on our platform. You are too small for us to be able to. We have a requirement for you to be at least, and I'm not just making this up, at least 1 billion, at least 2 billion in asset under management before we can do business with you, but we want to do business with you. And this is where, you know, now I do it more and more. I try to put them in front of their contradictions and saying, okay, so where you have the most chance to make impact, to actually effect impact, is at that stage where you have to run for a couple of tens of millions, all the way to 100 million, to 200 million, to 1 billion. If once I get to 1 billion, 2 billion, whether you invest 20 million with me or not, it's not going to really impact my business. Where it really impacts is to actually be part of that ramp up to that critical mass of assets where most investors now can start looking at you. So this is where I see a lot of the kind of contradictions between the commitments and the actual what is being really done on the field. And I'm telling you that, you know, from experience, but it's not really deterring you. It's just harder because we ultimately we just believe that yes, it's just commitments, it's just aspirational policies. Of course, they track it within the workforce and everything, and we can also discuss that workforce versus leadership, where you want to see diversity, where it's actually have the most impact.
Thank you. Kunle, I want to draw you into this discussion. What are your thoughts about the backlash? How can we lean into it?
Absolutely. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's discussion. I think I'm in agreement with the panelists holistically, and I'll be honest with the results that came up. I'm not surprised based on conversations I've had with asset owners. My guess was exploration and education or setting goals and metrics would be majority of the answer, but I'm very glad to see that the number in track progress is actually higher as well, and folks actually feel that they're making some progress towards goals that they've set. This means that folks are moving past the exploration stage and have overcome sort of the analysis paralysis that can cripple a lot of folks, especially when they're trying to implement strategies in their portfolios. So I'm very pleasant to see that goals have been set because this is the very crucial first step towards making that progress of moving away from a moment to making it more of a movement. I want to take a few minutes to share my thoughts on the backlash, as you mentioned, and why it even exists in the first place, because truly, you know, I welcome the scrutiny in this space. Let's take real estate investing as a quick parallel. If I communicated to an investor interested in that space, a property zip code, told them that it was an SFR, which is a single family rental with low LTV, loan to value ratio, 10 out of 10 investors would know exactly what I'm talking about. And I use these acronyms and jargons intentionally. But if I told those same 10 investors an ESG fund has a low carbon basket with reasonable ESG score and tangible metrics, those same 10 people would digest that information very differently. Why is that? Taxonomy, framework, standardization, disclosures, policies, ratings, all of these are still not as clearly defined in this space, which in my observed opinion plays a lot into the backlash and the scrutiny that's happening. Drawing on some of those parallels from my early days in the derivative markets, the ISDA, which is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, developed a framework and governance that provided transparency and industry operational structure for that market. Leaning into this backlash for me means a push towards industry standardization, speaking a common language, well-defined language when it comes to ESG impact and sustainability holistically. Quite frankly, this is what excites me the most about the future of this space. When others see confusion, I see an opportunity to be part of a collective that provides a robust, stable, strong financial and impact framework for the ecosystem. And I encourage everyone to lean into that thought process because that's the only way we can truly move forward and get on the same page as an industry.
Thank you for that. One of the, as people were registering for this webinar, one of the questions that we got back in terms of a goal for what they would want to hear is for us to address, what are the barriers to institutions implementing DEI, JEDI approaches in their portfolio. So let's take another poll from our audience. What are the barriers to designing and implementing a DEI lens for your endowment or for your clients' endowments or institutions, depending on where you stand? Is it distracted by bigger challenges, lingering view that DEI lens will negatively impact your portfolio's performance? Surprisingly enough, I still hear that in different spaces. Legal pushback on having goals embedded in the investment policy statement, the governing document for endowment portfolios. Not considered part of the fiduciary duty, that issue continues to come up, or lack of agreement on what the goals should actually be, to Kunle's point. All right, let's look at this. It looks like lack of agreement on goals, definitely a 45% share. Distracted by bigger challenges, definitely in today's environment. We can see that. What are your views? How can we lean into this? Love to, maybe we'll lead off with Kunle this time and then go around the horn.
Absolutely, and happy to share from the perspective from Capricorn and where I work, because we've prided ourselves as being one of the largest mission-aligned investment firms in the world. Here we go again with taxonomy, mission-aligned. What does that mean? Mission-aligned investing is just, really aligning an organization's asset with their institutional values and mission. Alignment of these assets with mission for intentional and measurable impact is one of the ways to walk the talk, even more so when it comes to racial equity investing. One of my favorite quotes is very simple. What is hard, meaning these are not easy barriers to navigate. And because some organizations may have figured out what works well for them, doesn't make these barriers easier to navigate. I think there is, I think that this is where the role of outsourced CIOs or CIOs or consultants continue to play a significant role, as evidenced by the growths of these organizations over the past 5 years. Capricorn has served as sort of these mission-aligned OCIOs for anchored portfolios, which is the Skoll Foundation and the Skoll family of Skoll over 20 years. And a lot of those lessons learned and best practices from the flexibility of having a select number of clients are what we've realized is in demand in today's environment, with volatility, volatile markets, and increased complexity holistically in esoteric asset classes. We're really opening our doors now into folks who want to join us on those best practices, but understanding that each investor's appetite is different and particular. I'd love to say that we figured it out, but that is very, very far from the truth. And I'd be wary of anyone who claims that they have the Cadillac of DEI solutions. For us, the lessons are in the journey, not in the destination. And we're on the journey of desired transformation, especially as it pertains to JEDI, given our strengths has historically been in deep tech climate-focused work. And so, would love to even share, before I pass this on, a little bit of our talk when we come to the acronyms. For the J, we believe the efforts on and this is justice, the efforts on systemic changes, challenging society's assumption on how things are done, which is not always mainstream. Investment opportunities do provide a theory of change that could directly address institutional disenfranchisement of women and BIPOC communities. On the E, we believe investing in equitable communities benefit individuals by creating opportunities for affordable homes, access to healthcare, quality schools, good paying jobs. These opportunities allow individuals to invest in themselves, their families, local businesses that provide goods and services that the community needs. If these investments succeed and are redeployed, previously neglected communities may see reinforcing cycles of a sense of ownership and empowerment. And on the D and the I, we really seek diversity and inclusion opportunities that have immediate short-term benefits for individuals who otherwise wouldn't have had access or would have difficulty accessing key and fundamental services or capital in our current social and economic structures. And so when I say transformative impact, it really hinges upon breaking down these barriers that were previously preventing access initially. On a lighter note, and I'll just really end.
Well, Kunle, I'm just going to jump in here to keep the flow going. But
absolutely.
So you covered some of the goals, but maybe Habib, you could talk about this lingering view around DEI lens negatively impacting the portfolio, and then the whole fiduciary duty question, which always seems to come back.
Yeah, I think I saw 15% for and 15% for the part of fiduciary duty and the negatively impact portfolio performance. It's a low number, but it's not low enough. And I also would link it to the response, the answer A, which was distracted by bigger challenges, i.e. performance. There is, what I would say is that, first of all, diversity needs context. I come from an international and global background. The conversation is not the same in the US or in Europe or in Asia. The way you view diversity or you set those goals are different. And just also going back to the ESG backlash that Kunle was discussing a bit earlier, that's the same thing. We see more of the backlash in the US, and when you go to Australia, for instance, or you go to Europe in the Nordics, there's no such backlash because this is something that is already stable stake. So now going back to the question, there is abundant research and very serious research that shows that and that finds that a lack of diversity is a massively opportunity to perform better. So there's a link between diversity and better performance, and that's why. But it has to be done well, and that's why I like to call diversity. I like to rename it to actually drive it home as a diversified human capital, because at the end of the day, this is what it is. Human capital is a capital, and I'm not making this up. This is really the most important input that you can have in the company to produce goods. And I can point you to some research I was talking about. So McKinsey, that you may know, actually they came up with a trilogy, which actually goes well with the theme of the JEDI, a trilogy about diversity. It's called Delivering Through Diversity in 2015 already, Diversity Matters in 2018, and Diversity Wins in 2022. And what they were showing basically, and we've updated data, is that on average, surveying 1,000 global companies, they showed that top quartile companies from an ethnicity or from a gender diversity point of view or standpoint outperform the companies who have less diversity, and by 36% by 36% for the ethnicity, and by 25% for gender. So it's shown, and the gap is even widening, which is also something that companies are now trying to take into account. Cornell, same thing, came with a study where they were actually showing that ISS, which is the proxy advisor, has a comprehensive database of 230,000 plus directors. And when they actually look at those companies more granularly, they see that the companies who have at the top, at the leadership or at the board level, who have a critical mass of diverse directors, whether it's gender or ethnicity, tend to perform and to outperform the companies who have less or zero. And you'll be surprised, there's a lot of companies who have zero diversity at the senior leadership level. And CFA Institute, same thing. So what I'd like to leave the audience with is really, it's a massively missed opportunity. So it's not just a cause, there's a business investment thesis, there's a business investment case that is very strong. And so this actually leads me to the fact that, yes, you may be distracted by performance, but your company is actually can deliver better performance if the company implements diversity better. And when I say it has to be done well, research also shows that they talk about something called the trickle-down effect. So it's more effective to start at the top for many, many reasons, especially when you look at diversity at the workforce level. This is what I do from a portfolio management standpoint. I don't really look at the workforce level because I know it's not very difficult today in the US to get an entry-level job in any company. So whether you look at FedEx, you look at United Airlines, you look at any company, when you look at the entry-level job, yes, there's a lot of diversity, even more than we can hope. But the problem is that the E and the I and the J, which is equity, inclusion, and the justice, tend to be lost as you climb the ladder, the corporate ladder. And what research described as the trickle-down effect is that when you're a very talented candidate, a very talented employee, and you have an entry-level job, a middle management job, it's easier for the company to retain you if you can see yourself reflected in the top management. And this is where we go back to human capital, because companies want to be able to attract, to retain, and to be able to promote the talent. And this is where actually the opportunity is missed opportunities, because we see figures that I look at, statistics that I look at when I'm making investment in my portfolios, for instance, are turnover. Turnover is very expensive for companies. And where does that cost go? Directly on the balance sheet. And I'm going to stop here because I see.
Okay, thanks, Habib. So, we can apply that to the fund manager level, right? So an under allocation to high performing, diverse-led, diverse-owned fund managers is also going to tie right back to that performance issues, those barriers that we were talking about. Dorian, I want to draw you in and get your perspective on how to lean into these barriers.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think one, it starts on an individual level about what you actually, the beliefs that you actually hold and how those carry over to your company. So what do you believe about diverse populations? Do you believe that they should have the same type of access to capital that maybe you do and your company do? Do you believe in models that are promoting ownership in communities of color and in and around that? I think you won't really make any progress on equity and inclusion until you actually see people as assets, right? And you see them for their assets and the assets that they bring to the table. When you're talking about the DEI portion, is DEI again, something that more so people do for a PR strategy? Do you think that you're doing those diverse populations? I think the way that it's seen sometimes is that they feel like they're doing those diverse populations a favor by hiring them, when actually you're actually creating real value for your company by being able to bring folks on. So I think it has to be a shift in terms of how you think about the mindset, what you think about the assets in and around for people. I think it also is the way that we frame when we're talking about diverse asset managers, right? Habib talked a little bit about it, is this language around emerging managers, right? When I hear that, I hear an excuse to undercapitalize, or what people use to undercapitalize those fund managers, right? He's been in the industry for 20 plus years. At what point does he graduate from emerging to qualified investor to be able to actually lean into investments? And I think we have to be very careful about the language that we're using, because it affects what and how we deploy capital, and who we deploy capital to. And then I think the last piece is in and around, how long companies actually think that they're going to, or investment firms think that they're going to be able to outrun the negative externalities of, racism and beyond, right? And I think, you're going to continue to be confronted with those. And I think for a lot of individuals, a lot of corporations, they have the misconception that they're going to be able to outrun these externalities for a longer period of time than they actually are. And the need to be able to lean in on the equity piece is actually going to create the value that they're looking for. And then also being able to bring on or bring in diverse teams allows you to find hidden alpha within and around communities that help then create equity across a wider platform. So I think we have to look at it in a few different ways, but I also think, first and foremost, we have to reframe who we think should have access to capital, and what it actually means to be able to invest capital at scale into those spaces, right? From novel capital strategies to beyond.
Those are all great points. I think just wanting to reiterate that we already have the studies that establish that diversity contributes to performance. We already have the study that the Knight Foundation did with the Global Economics Group, that there was no difference in performance between diverse managers, diverse-owned managers, and non-diverse-owned managers. So there's no performance gap that explains the under-allocation to diverse-led managers. And if you put it in the context of the portfolio and the market context today, if you have an under-allocation to high-performing managers, that's going to impact your possibilities for performance. And then going back to Kunle's points about, how you set your goals, Dorian's and Habib's points as well, tying back, what are you trying to do? What are the problems that you're trying to solve as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion and JEDI approaches, and weaving that into your approach so that you're really aligning your implementation with your organization's values and goals. And that should help to mitigate some of the legal pushback that you sometimes experience because you're really grounding it in your organization. We were talking about the Knight Foundation and recent studies. I know we're starting to run out of time. We do want to make sure we have time for question and A, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about this. The Knight Foundation was talking about what's happening in foundation endowment portfolios. They recently did a study, an initial study of the wealthiest 25 private universities and public universities. And ultimately 16 out of 50 of the colleges and universities participated in the study, which is focused on higher education endowments. And those 16 institutions represented about 54% of the group's endowment assets, and that was about $314 billion. But 34 of the 50 institutions, roughly 68%, didn't disclose their diversity statistics or any data, which made it difficult. So that was representing about $273 billion in assets. So this brings this question of transparency and how important transparency is in addressing JEDI in our industry. So we have one more poll question, and we'll ask this and talk about this and then maybe open it up. Does your endowment or your client's endowment, depending on where you stand, offer transparency to the public on diverse manager representation in your portfolio? Yes or no? Okay. Oh, a pretty good number, 56% said yes, but a meaningful proportion said no at 44%. Before we get into this panel discussion, I do want our panelists to be brief so that we can get into the Q&A, but I want to broaden the lens beyond diverse managers, but also talk about, because if we're going to be holistic and talking about the intersections of DEI and endowment portfolios in our industry, I think it should also include a discussion of recruiting, mentorship, sponsorship, promotions, turnover. And we've touched on some of those topics, and I'm not leading you to speak at length, but I do want you to touch on it in a more holistic way. It's not just about diverse managers, it's also about who's coming through the pipeline. So interested in our panelists to jump in here. Dorian, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. I think, one of the pieces is, it goes back to that statement in and around belief, right? And who do you qualify as being capable of making effective investments? And so I think we have to shift our thoughts on that, because if we don't, we'll never make investments at scale. And if we're trying to actually think about impact or investing for impact, and kind of positioning how we think about value, scale is going to have to be able to meet scale. I think what you're talking about from the university standpoint is pretty telling. When you're looking at endowments from universities, there's no HBCU with a $1 billion endowment, right? I think that what comes closest is Howard with about 700 million. In fact, I think if you take the top 10 HBCU endowments, you wouldn't hit $2 billion. Where you have places like Duke or places like Harvard that raised 9.4 billion in their last capital campaign. And so we need to think about what investment looks like at scale, and then how do we make sure that we're pushing capital into those spaces with the belief that this is not a riskier investment than any other investment that I would make, but that there are capable people able to do that. I think from the foundation side, and then I'll stop, is, it's not just about what folks are doing with the 5% that they put out in terms of their grants, it's what they're actually doing with the other 95% in their endowments. And if you're really looking for total portfolio management, you're actually looking to create equity in and around those spaces for your investment and beyond, you need to bring not just 5%, but you need to bring the other 95% and bring 100% of what your capital or available capital to bear as you're thinking about total portfolio management into and around those investments. And so I think we have to be more thoughtful about who we capitalize, how we capitalize them, are we capitalizing them at scale, and then also have a deep belief that there's talent that's out there. I think what we run into a lot on the philanthropic side is that we often reward people who tell the worst stories the best in our communities, about our communities. And then we follow with a pretty deep underinvestment. We use terms like pilot or like, I just said around emerging managers, which is, code language for we are about to undercapitalize this initiative and probably be very fickle in the future around how we invested in the future. So we have to be very thoughtful about the language, and then we also have to be very thoughtful about the size and the scale of the investment that we make and who we're making into it and who we deem capable of managing that investment.
Thank you. Kunle, how are your clients responding on transparency with the public on diversity in their portfolios?
Right. Sorry, I get super passionate about the work ahead, so I'll keep my response here up to under 60 seconds. I'd really just sort of say you cannot improve what you don't measure. And in my opinion, this is what sets ESG and impact investing apart. The ability to take on the obligation, not just to measure the financial performance, but to also quantify the impact your capital has made, and is super important. And so I am definitely a team transparency, and there are a lot of clients that I talk to that are definitely that. Now, I'll just end with, to support what Dorian has said, a quote from Melinda Gates in a chat with David Letterman: if we can connect over our humanity and we see that in one another, we want the same things, then we start to help think about solutions or bring resources in or knowledge to help people lift themselves up. We all have to make that contribution. And so I would just end on that note, that transparency is very important for us to be able to move the work ahead.
Habib?
I almost cannot add anything to what has been said already. The poll responses and what you said before, Tamara, makes me just think that, it's easier to be transparent on things that you are proud of. And this is why we're getting non-disclosures. And it's not just on DEI, it's also on a lot of other things. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And to go in the same direction as Dorian, undercapitalization and all those problems. I mentioned earlier, emerging manager now is kind of put in a pigeonhole. And it's also equates to a diverse manager. And really, some examples I like to share is that when you are a woman or when you are a person of color and you spin off your company to start a new firm, you are easily referred to as an emerging manager. And that when it's not the case, when you're part of the majority, you are referred to a spin-off. And just that element of language is very important. And that's why, all those allies, people we're talking to that are part of the majority, because just like when they said it very well, we have to connect all over. My work really focuses on showing them the value, to show them that it's more than a cause, that it's an investment thesis. And yes, so we are all in this together, and people who actually are able to see and start do the work and lead on the work are going to be the winners of tomorrow.
Excellent. George, I think you're scrolling through the chat box to see what we're getting in terms of questions from our audience.
Yes, well, thank you all for that great conversation. We've got a couple of good questions, and just a reminder for folks to put more questions in the Q&A. And one was just around a request to share the citations of the studies that Habib mentioned, so we can certainly circulate those to all the participants after the webinar. And then we got a great question here from a university trustee who says, making the case for JEDI reminds me of the early days of making the case for ESG. Beyond research supporting how JEDI can positively impact returns while being the equitable path, what quantifiable metrics can be implemented into a public university's IPS? What specific goals can we set for our OCIO that they can then track?
Maybe I'll jump in here. I think one of the interesting ways is to track it in terms of the percentage of your assets. What are, we can break it up as we were talking about, let's take a more holistic lens. We could break it up in terms of diverse owned managers, where you see diverse leadership in key decision-making roles for portfolios, where you see more progress in transitioning talented young people of color moving through those ranks, as we were saying earlier, like, are you seeing that progression into senior executive leadership roles? Also thinking about to what extent your capital is going to fund founders that are diverse, or products and services that are targeting diverse communities. There's a lot of different ways you could tease out what resonates with your organization in terms of your goals, and then structure metrics around that track it. A lot of times you can just start to track it as part of your IPS, as opposed to setting goals, if that's something that you're getting a lot of pushback on. Begin with the tracking of it, and then that institutionalizes that as part of your process, and then start talking about, well, how can we increase from where we are? So anyway, I'll open it up to our other panelists to talk about metrics as well.
I would say one of the other things is to make sure that it is one of the core elements of your institution, right? And that it doesn't just sit into the investment realm, but it also speaks to your academic goals. It also speaks to your community goals. It also speaks to your research goals. That we're thinking about our investments not in isolation from the other things that we're supposed to produce, right? And I think that brings it when you're talking about your IPS, it brings it into a greater alignment for what you're trying to do. And so as you're looking at, even from investments that are community-based investments, from a real estate perspective on, right? I know a lot of our universities are also some of our biggest real estate owners, right? What is and how does that look like in terms of what you're investing in goals, and what kind of returns are you actually looking to see that fall across the environmental and the social and the governance spectrum across the board? And so I think it can't just live in the investment piece. It has to be part of and embedded in part of your broader strategy, because again, it goes into what's quantifiable, but also what is the right thing to do, right? And you can, when you have to be able to bring those two things into alignment, and the right thing to do as being the foundational piece for what and how you think about your investments anyways.
Other questions, George?
Yeah, there are a couple. I just want to add, I think that's a great point, Dorian. And, you know, many universities do have chief diversity officers, and I think maybe inviting them in to, you know, talk to the investment committees, look at what types of goals and metrics they're tracking on the institutional level. There might be some good insights for that kind of alignment there. And this is something actually Paris Prince, our director of JEDI, is going to be diving into more, is actually connecting with the Association of Diversity Officers and really, you know, helping to kind of build that alignment across the institution on some of these topics. So I think that's a great point. And just before going to the next question, Tamara, I'm just curious too, I think your point is great about the types of metrics, and there are many. Is there sort of a sweet spot you'd recommend on how many metrics might be appropriate? Because there are so many aspects to this. Is there a point when too many metrics become overwhelming, or how should trustees think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways you can approach it, right? Because there are providers in the market that can provide you with a full report that can cover a full suite, a number of metrics, and then you can kind of zero in on the ones on a kind of customized basis that you're really going to focus on, that, to Dorian's point, really align with your mission and your efforts, your values as an organization, your history as an organization. How does this align with who you are? And really zero in on those metrics in your IPS, but still have access to a broader set of metrics that are being tracked over time. So that's one more flexible way to approach it, so that you're not trying to do everything in expanding your IPS document, you know, so much that you can kind of lose focus. So I think a very focused, customized approach helps you to really resonate and draw in other key stakeholders within your organization and outside of it too.
I'm just going to tag in a comment very quickly, which is just to really encapsulate what Tamara had said. I think you should think of it more as outcome focused rather than output focused, right? And when you have that perspective, it makes it a little more defined. It's not the quantity of metrics that you're tracking, but the actual number and qualification of what it is that you're tracking that actually brings substance to what you're looking at.
And one thing I would add, it goes to the outcome, the focus on the outcome as well. You know, I sit on investment committees of OCIOs and advising them. And most times they also have those values that they say, oh, we really commit to D and I. This is what we want to do. And it's easy to challenge them and say, okay, maybe you're doing it also, you're looking at your personnel and you're diversifying, but how are you investing? How are you making your dollar work? And then you look at the selection of managers, and they just default to the big ones. They default to BlackRock, to Vanguard, and that's it. And I'm telling them, I just challenge them because I have nothing to gain out of it. I just tell them, you know, you aware that there's a lot of other managers that are out there, and not as many as the BlackRocks and other managers, but a lot of them that are diverse owned, that are doing great work, that you have to find, and that are easy to find, and that you have also to put in the process, and see how they measure versus those big managers. And we're not asking to put all your investment in one, but at least diversify also your investment based on that thing. And you would be surprised how many are really taken aback by that, because they really default, because for them is the safer way of doing it. If they overperform, it's great, they made a great choice. If they underperform, wait, they actually pick BlackRock, which is one of the best in the business. But we know a lot of managers that actually that perform better or perform equally, and the database are available, and it's very easy to find them.
Great, thank you. So we've got another question here that's maybe not as directly investment related, but around fundraising, that asks, are any of you aware of any endowments or foundations that have done fundraising for dedicated JEDI investment strategies? So sort of leveraging that commitment to JEDI in the investment process to help raise money.
I'm not aware of anywhere they're acting in a role where they're formally helping to directly help raise money. But what we do see is that oftentimes those that are very interested in being catalytic and addressing this issue of how do I get to 100 million if no one will invest with me until I get to that point, that circular process, that they'll say, look, we are willing to be an investor early on, and we will allow you to share our name as you fundraise, and we are willing to be an active reference for you as you fundraise about why we are committed to, why we are willing to make a commitment to your fund, what we think the investment case is, and why we're so excited about that. And that can be very powerful and catalytic in terms of helping to address that dynamic. It's like, I can't get to 100 million if no one will take that first step. And so we're seeing more of that type of activity amongst investors.
I'll maybe answer the question a little differently. Foundations I know that are moving to sort of that 100% mission alignment across the entire corpus, the McKnight Foundation, Nathan Cummings Foundation, Heron Foundation, Skoll Foundation, just to name a few.
Great, thank you. So we got another one here in the chat around asking about if there are benchmarks of the results of purpose or diversity-driven actual investments versus from the diversity of the asset manager that you can share.
I want to make sure we understand that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure to get it.
Yeah, so I'm just reading it through here too, but so I guess benchmarks are the results of investing in.
Oh, okay, where the strategy is focused on diversity or sustainability relative to the profile of the manager.
Yes.
Yes. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, certainly there are, benchmarks that, kind of track or aggregations of performance of sustainable funds and things like that. We don't yet have a lot of case studies, I think, that cover a full market cycle, but I'm curious if the other panelists are aware of any that could show kind of how a foundation that has been very explicit and intentional around it, how that has performed over a full market cycle. We certainly are seeing more to that point of transparency about endowment portfolios that have diverse managers or have a diverse manager approach and how they're doing. But in terms of benchmarks, I'm not aware of any, but I'm interested. Maybe Habib can weigh in here.
Yes, I can take that question because I surveyed the markets for years and years looking for that answer. So there are many of them. I would say a handful, and I would say we don't. I mean, the way we view investing is not necessarily aligned with how those benchmarks are constructed. But there's a very good one that we liked that is being published by ISS ESG. ISS ESG is the quantitative research arm of the proxy advisor institutional shareholders. It's called the ISS ESG US Diversity Index. And that index has been around for many years now. And if you go, it's just a US all cap domestic. And what they're doing, they are selecting companies that are displaying that way you can track that have at least 35% of board members that are diverse, that are women, and 35% of board members that are from the minority, from the ethnic minority. And they have, I think they picked that 35% as a critical mass because research also shows that when it's below that, you cannot really have any effect on around the board table. And they also look at that at the NEO level, which is the non-executive officer. So think about CEO, CFO, or the C-suite level, and senior leadership management. So the bottom line is that when you look at that strategy, that index, it's very easily foundable. I can share with you the ticker. In terms of performance, it's outperformed the Russell 3000, it outperformed the S&P 500 by almost 2% every single year since 2017, and last year by 800 basis points, if my memory serves me well. So, it's not only, that's why I was saying a bit earlier, you're not just doing this for the sake of doing it, where all those research that are showing that it shows value, and we go to webinars, to seminars, to conferences where we see all those charts, you have actually strategies that are implementing them the right way, I would say, and the investment case is proven because you're outperforming and you're not giving up anything because the tracking error with those indexes are rather low, and you still have your domestic US investment. So this is what we tell those foundations or institutions who actually want to do it. You can still do it and not be under the impression that you're giving up something on the table, which is usually what people have a hard time to get out of the back of their mind. And sometimes I always joke that it would be easier for me to get grants than to get investment money.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I think you can, where folks can go to put their grant dollars versus where they put their investment dollars, that there's completely different hats I think that people put on. I have a question, I think, into the space, or maybe it's a comment that the other panelists can react to. I think that we have to be really careful about where and how we're talking about benchmarking against a different set of values, right? Or are we benchmarking and almost creating a different set of diligence, a different set of tracking, a different level of scrutiny for diverse managers than we are for managers or majority type managers? And so, what have you guys experienced in and around that space? Because I think that is, we have to just be really careful about what and how we think about almost kind of creating a secondary criteria for our diverse managers versus we're looking at value as a whole, and maybe we need to redefine how we think about value versus who we think about, or how we define who's investing our capital. So just reactions from the panel on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in my pro bono work as a finance committee member for a few foundations, we've had conversations about benchmarking and aggregating performance that in a way that's not apples and apples, where you're just saying, okay, well, all these managers are diverse, but should we really be comparing the performance of a diverse owned private equity manager relative to a public markets manager? And would we do that in that way, specific way, with a conventional portfolio? So how can we map how we're approaching our diverse manager approach in a way that's fair and is more reflective of how we do it in the conventional space as well? So just really being thoughtful about how we approach it from a technical perspective, so we're not designing the question in a way that doesn't really make sense.
I think on JEDI topics, it's not a one size fit all. So I lean more on the best practices efforts than a benchmarking effort. And so that's where I really leave it, in that there is still an opportunity for institutions and entities to come out with their best practices and what works well for them. But I wouldn't say that they need to be held, everyone else needs to be held to that standard to be able to achieve those same type of results for whatever they're looking at in terms of strategy.
Looks like we're running short on time. I'm really excited to have had this follow-up conversation. I'll hand it off to George to wrap things up.
Yes, well, we got to almost all the questions. There's a couple more good ones, so maybe we can share some thoughts from the panel in our follow-up email, where we'll also share some of those studies, some of the other resources referenced in this conversation. But I just want to give a huge thanks again to our panelists, and Tamara, for you for moderating a great conversation. Again, this is part of an ongoing series, so please do keep an eye out for upcoming conversations. We've actually got our next webinar coming up later this month, focused on decarbonization and our climate work. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have the third in this series for the summer in August around JEDI themes. And that is a theme that will obviously continue to go deeper on within the network. So thank you all again for your time and for joining us today. Please do be in touch if you've got ideas or feedback for us on this programming and the network itself. And have a great day. We'll be in touch soon.